The hiss of the reinforced plasteel door echoed in the sterile observation gallery as Douglas Wilson stepped up to the thick, triple-paned window. Beyond it, in a stark containment cell bathed in harsh, diagnostic light, crouched what the Xylos station personnel only ever called Specimen 734, or more crudely, the Eliani Terror. Whispers of inherently aggressive, unstable genetic markers and containment failure imminent had dogged Douglas since his arrival, but the veteran xenorelations consultant tuned them out. His gaze, honed by decades of first contacts and interspecies crises, was fixed on the tiny, dark carapaced form, noting the rhythmic tremors that spoke less of aggression and more of profound fear. For Xylos Station's Protectorate staff, Subject 734 was a key unknown, the sole unusual survivor of a recent supposedly wild species. But as Douglas Wilson looked past the intimidating biological traits designed for a harsh homeworld, he saw something else entirely, a terrified, orphaned child, barely old enough to understand she was alone in the universe. The click of regulation issue heels on the polished deck plating announced an arrival before the voice. Mr. Wilson, Commander Eva Rostova, Xylos Station's chief, came to a halt beside him, her posture as rigid as the station's emergency bulkheads. Her uniform was impeccably creased, her dark hair pulled into a severe knot that allowed no stray strands. I trust your initial overview confirms our assessment. Specimen 734 is a Class Omega threat. Containment is not a guideline, it's a directive. Her gaze flicked to the cell, then quickly away, a micro-expression of distaste tightening her lips. Douglas kept his eyes on the small figure within the light. Zara, he said, the name soft, almost a thought, rather than a spoken word. He could make out more details now, the childlike proportions despite the alien physiology. The carapace, segmented like ancient, dark armor, gleamed dully under the relentless light. Her eyes, disproportionately large in the small face, were pools of shadow that reflected the sterile illumination with an unnerving intensity, an effect that likely fueled the Terror moniker. Tiny claws, needle-sharp by the look of them, were visible at the ends of her multi-jointed fingers, but they were curled inward, pressed against her body as if trying to retract into nothingness. She was a knot of defensive posture, making herself impossibly small in the far corner of the cell. He turned slightly to face the commander, his expression calm, measured. Commander Rostova, my objective is a comprehensive xenorelations assessment, to understand its nature, its behavior, its capacity for communication, if any. The current designation is preliminary, based on limited and, if I may say, rather agitated initial contact reports. He held her gaze. I'll need access to all existing data files and observation logs pertaining to specimen 734. Rostova's eyebrow arched, a minute shift in her controlled features. Understand its nature, Mr. Wilson. Its nature is to survive, and its survival mechanisms are formidable. A curt nod. You'll have the data. It will be transferred to your terminal. She paused, her voice dropping a fraction, though losing none of its steel. But direct interaction will be strictly limited. Non-contact observation only, through this viewport, under Level 4 security protocols. Any deviation, any attempt to circumvent established procedure, and your assessment is terminated. Am I clear? Later, in a small, sterile data review alcove just off the main gallery, Douglas scrolled through the logs. his teeth clenched with each entry. Subject exhibited aggressive lunging behavior. The accompanying visual, a brief grainy clip, showed a terrified flinch as a capture net deployed. Vocalizations indicate hostile intent. The audio file captured a high-pitched keen of pure distress, a sound any parent of any species would recognize as fear. Every report was a mirror of the station's pervasive anxiety, not a window into the creature's reality. Conjecture piled upon conjecture, each layer reinforcing the foregone conclusion of monster. This wasn't xenobiology, it was xenophobia, codified. He rose and sought out the commander again. She was at the central monitoring station, her attention divided across a dozen status screens. "Commander Rostova," Douglas began, his tone even. "Based on my initial review of the logs and my direct observation, I request a minor modification to specimen 734's immediate environment." Rostova turned, her expression unreadable. "A modification?" "The current intensity of the diagnostic lighting," Douglas explained, "and a persistent, low-frequency hum I can detect from what I assume is the adjacent power conduit, are likely exacerbating its stress responses. Dimming the lights by 30% and, if possible, dampening the conduit vibration could provide a more baseline behavioral assessment." He framed it as a procedural refinement, an appeal to data purity he hoped she might recognize. Commander Rostova considered him for a long moment, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the console. "One modification, Wilson," she conceded, her voice flat. "The lights, we can attenuate them from control. The conduit hum is integral to the cell's primary power grid. Dampening is not feasible without compromising containment integrity, which is non-negotiable." Her eyes, chips of ice, met his. "You are aware that any reduction in visibility, however slight, increases risk to personnel and station security. This adjustment is on your authority, and your sole responsibility. Security teams will be on heightened alert, and your observation privileges will be under constant review." Douglas nodded. "Understood, Commander." He returned to the observation gallery. A moment later, a subtle shift occurred within the cell. The harsh glare softened, plunging the corners into deeper, less intimidating shadow. Douglas watched, his breath held. Minutes stretched, marked only by the faint thrum of the station's life support. Then, a flicker of movement from the huddled shape. It seemed to uncoil, just a fraction, a slow, hesitant unfurling. A single multi-jointed digit, previously clenched tight against its chest, relaxed almost imperceptibly. The rhythmic tremors that had shaken its small frame lessened, not ceasing entirely, but easing from a frantic vibration to a mere shiver. It was infinitesimal, a change so subtle anyone already convinced of the Eliani terror, might have dismissed it as nothing. But Douglas saw, and a sliver of something that felt dangerously like hope pierced through the sterile cold of Xylos Station. The dimmed lighting continued to cast long shadows across the containment cell, but Douglas noted a subtle shift. Zara, still huddled in the corner, was less tightly curled, her dark carapace gleaming faintly in the low light. The rhythmic trembling that had defined her since his arrival seemed marginally diminished. Over several observation cycles, the slight improvement persisted, a fragile bloom of calm in a field of fear. For hours, Douglas meticulously reviewed audio recordings of Zara's vocalizations, his fingers dancing across the console controls. The hisses weren't uniform, Some were sharp and staccato, others drawn out and guttural. The chitters, too, varied in pitch and frequency. He began to identify patterns correlating specific sounds with observed behaviors. A high-pitched chitter preceding feeding time, a low growl when station personnel approached the cell too quickly. Hunger, discomfort, fear, each seemed to have its own distinct sonic signature. They weren't random aggression, he was increasingly certain. Dr. Thorne. Douglas's voice cut through the sterile quiet of the observation gallery. I'm beginning to suspect that specimen 734's vocalizations aren't simply instinctual responses. They may represent a rudimentary form of communication. He paused, anticipating the skepticism. I'd like to request access to a translation matrix. Run her vocal patterns through standard galactic communication protocols. See if anything resonates. Commander Rostova's voice crackled over the comms system. Consultant Wilson, with all due respect, we've already attempted translation using standard protocols. The results were inconclusive. I caution you against anthropomorphizing this creature. It's dangerous. Douglas sighed, rubbing his temples. I understand your concerns, Commander, but I believe a fresh approach is warranted. Based on Zara's observed feeding patterns, I'd also like to request a specific dietary modification. Introduce a nutrient-rich paste common to several carapace species. I believe it might be more palatable and nutritious than the standard protein blocks we're currently providing. Thorne's voice, hesitant but supportive, chimed in. It's an interesting hypothesis, Douglas. The protein blocks are formulated for a wide range of species, but they may not be optimal for Eliani physiology. However, we need to be cautious. Introducing a new food source could trigger allergic reactions or digestive complications. We'll need to monitor her closely. Rostova's reply was clipped. Very well. I'll approve a trial run of the dietary modification, Consultant Wilson. But under strict conditions. You will personally administer the paste through the remote feeding tube, minimizing direct exposure. And you will do so under constant surveillance. Any deviation from protocol will result in immediate termination of the trial. The following cycle, Douglas stood before the containment cell, the feeding tube snaking through the reinforced plasteel. He held the tube steady, the nutrient paste of viscous, gray-green substance slowly oozing towards the nozzle. As he approached the feeding port, Zara reacted violently. She hissed, a sound like escaping steam, and retreated further into the corner, her dark eyes wide with fear. She clearly associated the tube with previous unpleasant procedures, injections, forced examinations. Douglas stopped, pulling the tube back slightly. He lowered his voice, speaking in a low, soothing tone, even though he knew she likely didn't understand the words. Easy, Zara. Easy. It's okay. Just food. Nothing to be afraid of. He slowed down the feeding process, making deliberate, non-threatening gestures. He kept his movements slow, predictable. He avoided direct eye contact, knowing it could be perceived as a challenge. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Zara remained huddled in the corner, her gaze fixed on the tube with suspicion and fear. Finally, after a prolonged period of hesitation, she cautiously crept forward, her multi-jointed fingers twitching nervously. She sniffed the air around the nozzle, testing the scent. Then, with a sudden, darting movement, she tentatively sampled the nutrient paste. She consumed a small amount, then retreated again back to her corner, watching Douglas with wary eye. But she did not exhibit immediate signs of distress. Dr. Thorne, Douglas spoke into his Korn report. Heart rate slightly decreased, Consultant Wilson, Thorne replied. Stress hormone levels stabilizing. The initial indicators are positive. Continue monitoring for any adverse reactions. Rostova's voice, cold and unwavering, interrupted. Short-term improvements do not negate the long-term threat potential, Consultant Wilson. Do not let your feelings cloud your judgment. This creature remains a potential danger to this station and its personnel. Ignoring Rostova's comment, Douglas continued to observe Zara. A new detail caught his eye. As Zara tentatively lapped at the paste, a faint, fleeting bioluminescent flicker pulsed on her carapace, a soft, emerald-green light that vanished as quickly as it appeared. A possible emotional response, he surmised, tied to comfort or satisfaction. Commander, Douglas said, a new idea forming in his mind. I'd like to request permission to observe specimen 734 during her sleep cycle. I believe it will provide valuable insights into her natural behavior and potential trauma triggers. Rostova hesitated. That's highly irregular, Consultant Wilson, and potentially dangerous. I understand your concerns, Commander, but I believe the potential benefits outweigh the risks. We need to understand her better if we're ever going to assess her true nature. After another tense silence, Rostova conceded. Very well, I'll grant limited observation during her sleep cycle. But with a significant caveat. The observation will be conducted remotely via enhanced thermal imaging and audio sensors. There will be no visual contact, and I'm doubling security personnel. Any sign of unusual activity will trigger immediate lockdown. Is that understood? Understood, Commander, Douglas replied, his voice tight with anticipation. That night, Douglas sat before a bank of monitors in a darkened observation room. The thermal imaging display showed Zara curled up in the corner of her cell, her body radiating a faint heat signature against the cold plasteel. He listened intently through the enhanced audio sensors, picking up the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing, punctuated by occasional distressed vocalizations. Restless movements, twitching limbs. The thermal imaging revealed patterns consistent with a recurring nightmare or traumatic flashback. And then he saw it again. Fleeting patterns of bioluminescence, subtle fluctuations in Zara's carapace temperature, a language of light and heat he couldn't yet decipher, but knew instinctively spoke of profound distress. Douglas watched, his mind focused, his hands clenched into fists. He felt a surge of grit, a burning need to break through her trauma, to reach the terrified child hidden beneath the carapace of the Eliani Terror. But he also experienced a growing frustration, a simmering anger at the station's rigid protocols, the fear-driven approach that kept him, and everyone else, at arm's length. He knew with a growing certainty that more direct intervention was needed. He just had to figure out how to make it happen. The canvas walls offered little solace. Sleep evaded him, replaced by the haunting echo of Zara's nightmare. He rose before dawn, the chill of the Xylus station air seeping through his threadbare uniform. He needed to understand. He needed to help. He bypassed the mess hall, heading straight for the xenobiology lab. The door hissed open, revealing the familiar sterile environment, the hum of equipment, a constant backdrop to his thoughts. He pulled up the archived data from Zara's sleep cycle, the thermal readings painting a chaotic picture of fluctuating body temperature, the audio track a jumble of alien whimpers and distressed clicks. Douglas meticulously analyzed the data, his fingers flying across the console. The software rendered the sounds as complex waveforms, each spike and dip a potential clue. He isolated a recurring sound pattern, a series of low-frequency pulses that didn't match any known Eliani distress signals. It was too rhythmic, too structured to be a simple cry of fear. It sounded geological. He contacted Thorn. Aris, I need everything you have on the Eliani homeworld's environment. Geological surveys, atmospheric data, anything. Thorn, his face tired but curious, appeared on the comm screen. Douglas? Everything all right? Zara's nightmares. I think they're connected to something specific on her homeworld. I need to find out what. A few minutes later, Thorn transmitted a file. It's not much. The Eliani were only recently contacted, but we have some preliminary data from orbital scans, frequent seismic activity, volcanic eruptions, a very unstable environment. Holographic projections of the Eliani homeworld shimmered in the lab, showing a planet scarred by volcanic vents and deep fissures. Douglas stared at the data, a hypothesis forming in his mind. The recurring sound, could it be related to volcanic activity? He spent the next few hours constructing a low-frequency sound simulation, mimicking the rumble of a distant volcanic eruption. He adjusted the parameters, carefully modulating the frequency and intensity. That afternoon, during Zara's waking hours, he initiated the simulation. The sound, barely audible to human ears, filled the observation room. Zara, playing with a repurposed data cable, didn't initially react. Douglas watched her closely, monitoring her vital signs. Nothing. He repeated the simulation, increasing the volume slightly. Still nothing. But after repeated exposure, subtle signs began to emerge. Her heart rate, displayed on the monitor, ticked up a few beats per minute. Her pupils dilated slightly. He noticed a tightening of her carapace, the segments drawing closer together. She was reacting. He adjusted the frequency and intensity, pinpointing the specific parameters that triggered the strongest response. Her whimpers grew louder, more distressed. She flinched, curling in on herself. Then, during one simulation, she emitted a specific vocalization, a sharp, high-pitched cry that cut through the low rumble of the artificial volcano. It was different from anything he'd heard before. "Aris, did you hear that?" Douglas asked, his voice tight with excitement. Thorn, monitoring from his own station, nodded. "I recorded it. Analyzing now." Douglas Cross referenced the vocalization with the limited audio logs recovered from Zara's parents' crashed ship, searching for similar pattern. Hours passed, the lab growing dark as the artificial night cycle kicked in. He was about to give up when a match appeared on the screen. A vocalization, almost identical to Zara's, labeled as a warning call, used during geological instability events on the Eliani homeworld. A warning call. She wasn't just scared. She was remembering a specific threat. Commander Rostova's voice crackled over the comm system. "Consultant Wilson, report to my office immediately." He sighed, saving his data. "On my way, Commander." Rostova stood stiffly behind her desk, her expression grim. "I've been reviewing your activities, Wilson. This sound simulation experiment. I have serious concerns. Commander, I'm making progress. I'm starting to understand Zara's trauma, her communication patterns. You're causing her undue stress," Rostova countered, her voice sharp. "The reports are clear. Increased agitation, erratic behavior. This is exacerbating her aggressive tendencies." Thorn, standing behind Douglas, stepped forward. "With all due respect, Commander, The data shows otherwise. Douglas is providing valuable insights. We're learning more about the Eliani in weeks than we have in months. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Doctor, Rostova said, her gaze unwavering. But my priority is the safety of this station, and I will not tolerate experiments that put my personnel at risk. Douglas returned to the lab, his mind racing. He couldn't stop now. He was so close to a breakthrough. He decided to try something new. He introduced calming stimuli during the sound simulation. Soft, ambient lighting, gentle vibrations in the floor, a low, soothing hum. Zara, initially agitated by the volcanic rumble, seemed to respond to the calming stimuli. Her posture relaxed, her vocalizations softened. She still showed signs of distress, but they were less intense, less frequent. Then, something extraordinary happened. During a simulation with the calming stimuli, Zara tentatively approached the observation window. She reached out a small, clawed hand, pressing it against the plasteel, inches away from Douglas's own hand on the other side. A significant step, a gesture of trust. Suddenly, the comm system blared to life. All personnel. Lockdown. Repeat, all personnel. Lockdown. Unauthorized experiment in progress in xenobiology lab. Consultant Wilson, cease immediately. Rostova's voice, cold and implacable, followed. That is an order, Wilson. Douglas ignored her. He couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close. He looked at Zara, her large, dark eyes fixed on him. He hummed a low, calming melody, a simple tune from his childhood. And then Zara did something that made his heart leap. She tilted her head, listening intently, and then she mimicked the sound. A rough, guttural approximation, but undeniably the same melody. Ooh, she crooned, the sound alien yet familiar. A bridge built across the vast gulf of species and experience. Thorne stared, mouth agape. The lab door hissed open. Rostova stood there, flanked by 2 security officers. Her face was a mask of fury. Wilson, she said, her voice dangerously low. You're too attached. You're relieved of your duty. Rostova's voice, amplified by the observation room's comms, cut through the silence. Consultant Wilson, your assessment period is concluded. I must ask you to relinquish your access privileges and vacate this area immediately. Her tone was devoid of warmth, each word clipped and precise. Douglas turned, his expression unreadable. He offered Zara, still visible through the plasteel, a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then, without a word of protest, he removed the access chip from his wrist and placed it on the designated console. Rostova's security detail moved in, flanking him as she led him from the observation gallery. The heavy door hissed shut behind them, the sound echoing in the sterile corridor. His access to Zara's records vanished from his datapad the moment he stepped out of the observation room. Station resources, once readily available, now required layers of authorization he no longer possessed. He was effectively cut off. Inside the observation room, Thorne watched as Zara, initially still, began to stir. Her dark eyes, usually wide with apprehension, darted around the room, searching. When she didn't find Douglas, a low, guttural whine escaped her, a sound that resonated deep within Thorne's chest. She began pacing, her small claws clicking against the metal floor, the rhythmic sound amplifying her distress. Later, in Rostova's office, the commander steepled her fingers, her gaze unwavering. He was becoming too attached, Doctor. Objectivity is paramount in these situations. The Protectorate is already breathing down my neck about the resources we're expending on this. Specimen. Thorne shifted uncomfortably. With all due respect, Commander, Consultant Wilson has established a unique rapport with Subject 734, removing him so abruptly. It's detrimental to her well-being. He was making progress. Rostova's eyebrows furrowed. Progress? Or emotional compromise? We can't afford sentimentality, Doctor. This isn't some lost puppy. It's an Eliani. And the Protectorate has made it clear they want a detached assessment, not a human interest story. That evening, Douglas contacted Thorne through a secure, non-official channel. Aris, I need your help. I know this is a risk for you, but I'm worried about Zara. They've cut me off completely. Thorne hesitated. Douglas, I can't. Rostova's watching everyone closely. If I'm caught. I'm not asking you to break regulations, Aris, Douglas interrupted, his voice low and urgent. Just keep an eye on her. Let me know if anything changes. Anything at all. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Thorne sighed. All right, Douglas. But this stays between us. I can't promise much, just observations. Nothing official. The next day, Thorne's report was grim. She hasn't eaten anything since you left, Douglas. She refuses to interact with any of the staff, just sits in the corner, making those noises. Douglas, confined to his quarters, his datapad useless, felt a surge of helplessness. He remembered the station's schematics, memorized during his initial security assessment. There was a maintenance access point, a rarely used conduit that ran near Zara's enclosure. It wouldn't provide a clear view, but hours later, hunched over a salvaged diagnostics console, Douglas rerouted power, bypassed security protocols, and patched together a low-resolution feed from a long-dormant maintenance camera. The image was grainy, flickering, but it was enough. Zara was huddled in the far corner of her enclosure, her small form trembling. But it wasn't her posture that caught Douglas's attention. It was her carapace. A complex pattern of bioluminescent activity pulsed across its surface, a sequence of light and shadow he had never witnessed before. Days blurred into nights as Douglas pored over the limited visual data, meticulously charting the patterns, comparing them to known Eliani communication signals. He needed more information. Thorne, his face etched with worry, slipped Douglas a restricted data file. Eliani bioluminescence. It's all I could get without raising suspicion. Be careful, Douglas. The data was fragmented, incomplete, but it was a start. Douglas cross-referenced the patterns, running simulations, analyzing frequencies. The more he learned, the more his concern grew. The carapace pattern wasn't random. It was a signal, a complex, multi-layered distress call, far more sophisticated than anything the Protectorate had anticipated. Meanwhile, Rostova, acting on orders from the Protectorate, implemented new containment protocols. Sensory input was reduced, environmental controls tightened. Zara's world was shrinking, becoming more sterile, more isolating. Through the flickering camera feed, Douglas watched as Zara's distress signal intensified, the patterns becoming more frantic, more desperate. He had to do something. Using salvaged components and a modified version of the sound simulation equipment he'd had confiscated, Douglas calibrated a calming frequency, a low, resonant hum designed to soothe the Eliani physiology. He directed the signal toward Zara's enclosure, hoping, praying, it would reach her. For a moment, the frantic pulsing of her carapace seemed to falter. There was a brief pause, a flicker of something, a subtle shift in the pattern that might have indicated recognition. Hope surged through Douglas, quickly followed by a chilling realization. Rostover's voice crackled over the station's comms. Security alert. Unauthorized energy signatures detected in Sector Gamma, originating from Consultant Wilson's former quarters. Initiate lockdown. Rostova, her face grim, addressed her security team. Wilson is attempting to sabotage the station's systems. Find him. Secure his quarters. I want proof of his insubordination. As station security converged on his location, Douglas, scrambling to erase his digital footprint, stumbled upon something else entirely. A hidden partition within the Eliani ship logs, a series of encrypted files, a message buried deep within the data stream, a destination, a purpose, something far more significant than a simple escape. The child, the orphan. Douglas pushed the thoughts through his mind, a mantra against the sterile dread that threatened to consume him. He returned to the data logs from the crashed Eliani vessel, his fingers flying across the console, each tap a prayer. The fragmented navigational data, initially a jumble of alien symbols and corrupted code, was slowly yielding its secret. He isolated a recurring sequence, a string of glyphs that stubbornly refused to translate through standard algorithms. Hours blurred into a caffeine-fueled frenzy. He cross-referenced the sequence with known Eliani linguistic patterns, astronomical charts, and even obscure Xeno-religious texts. Finally, a breakthrough. A faint match in a pre-protectorate survey of a long-abandoned sector. He adjusted the parameters, reran the analysis, and a set of coordinates shimmered into focus. He leaned back, exhaustion warring with a surge of adrenaline. The coordinates pointed to a remote, uncharted system, far beyond the Protectorate's established trade route. A ghost system, he murmured, his fingers tracing the holographic projection. He sought out Thorne in the station's small, underfunded medical bay. The doctor's face was etched with worry. "Douglas, I need to speak with you. It's about Zara." Douglas's gut clenched. "What is it?" Thorne gestured to a biomonitor displaying a cascade of alarming readouts. "Her condition is deteriorating rapidly. Organ failure. Her physiology is unlike anything I've encountered. The standard treatments aren't working. In fact, they seem to be accelerating the decline. What does she need?" Douglas's voice was tight, barely a whisper. "There's a specialized treatment, a resonant bio-regeneration technique developed by the Lyra Collective. It's experimental, but it's had success with similar xenophysiological anomalies. The problem is it's only available at a handful of facilities, none of which are on Xylos." Thorne's gaze met Douglas's. "And you know one of them." Douglas did. He'd consulted on the Lyra Collective project years ago. He knew the procedure, the risks, and most importantly, the potential to save Zara. "Then we need to get her there." Thorne sighed. "I've already submitted a transfer request to Rostova. I don't expect it to be approved." He was right. Rostova's voice, cold and devoid of empathy, crackled over the Korn system an hour later. "Request denied, Dr. Thorne. Specimen 734's condition is too unstable for transport. Furthermore, her inherent threat level remains unacceptably high. Any resources expended on her care are a drain on station security." Douglas stared at the comm panel. His eyes hardened. "She's refusing treatment," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Thorne shook his head, his face pale. "I can't prove it, Douglas, but the readings. She's not even administering basic supportive care. It's as if she's letting her die." The realization hit Douglas like a physical blow. Rostova wasn't just following protocol. She was deliberately neglecting Zara, hoping the Eliani terror would simply cease to exist. He had to act, and fast. He retreated to his quarters, sealing the door and activating a hidden comm channel. A grainy image flickered to life, revealing the scarred face of a Rhodian smuggler named Jax. "Wilson," Jax rasped, his voice a synthesized growl. "Haven't heard from you in cycles. What do you need?" "Transport," Douglas said, his voice urgent. "I need to get to an uncharted system." "I have the coordinates," Jax chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Uncharted? That'll cost you, friend. Exorbitant price plus a little favor. Something I need done on the other side." "What kind of favor?" Douglas asked, his gut twisting. "Let's just say it involves retrieving some sensitive data from a protectorate installation." "Nothing you can't handle." Douglas hesitated. The smuggler's request was a clear violation of his principles, a betrayal of the very organization he served. But Zara's life hung in the balance. "What kind of data?" "Doesn't matter," Jack said, his eyes glinting. "You want the transport, you do the job. Otherwise, the little alien dies." The smuggler cut the connection, leaving Douglas to grapple with the impossible choice. He needed to get Zara to the Lyra Collective, but the price was his own integrity. Later that night, Thorne slipped into Douglas's quarters, his face pale and drawn. He handed Douglas a data chip. "Zara's complete medical diagnostics. Rostova has locked down the files, but I managed to copy them before she could wipe the system. It's all there, her genetic markers, her physiological responses, everything you'll need to prepare for the treatment." "You're risking everything," Douglas said, his voice filled with gratitude and concern. Thorne managed a weak smile. "Some things are worth risking. That little girl. She deserves a chance." Douglas spent the next few hours studying the schematics of Xylos Station, searching for a weakness, a loophole, anything that could give him an edge. He found a hidden security override code embedded in the station's original construction plans, a relic from a bygone era. It was a long shot, but it was his only hope. But Rostova was already one step ahead. The next morning, the security around Zara's enclosure was tighter than ever. New laser grids crisscrossed the corridors, and heavily armed guards patrolled every corner. Rostova, it seemed, was anticipating his move. He outlined his plan to Thorne. "I'm going in. I'll use the access key to skip the security points. You create a distraction, lead the guards from the area." "It's too risky," Thorne protested. "It's Zara's only chance." As Douglas approached Zara's enclosure, his heart pounded in his chest. He input the override code into the security panel, his fingers trembling. A green light flickered, and the laser grid shimmered, then vanished. He was in. But as he stepped into the enclosure, Zara's carapace began to glow with an intense, unfamiliar light, bathing the cell in an ethereal luminescence. The air crackled with energy. Suddenly, Rostova's voice boomed over the comm system. "Consultant Wilson, you are in violation of Protectorate security protocols. Stand down immediately." Rostova, flanked by a squad of heavily armed security personnel, appeared at the entrance to the enclosure, her face a mask of cold fury. "You are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and endangering the security of Xylos Station." "I'm trying to save her life," Douglas shouted, his voice echoing in the sterile chamber. "You're letting her die." "She is a threat, Wilson, a danger to us all. I will not allow you to jeopardize this station for a monster." Douglas glanced at Zara. Her condition was worsening, her breathing shallow and ragged. He was out of time. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small portable stasis device, a last resort he had hoped he wouldn't need. "I'm sorry, Zara," he whispered, "but I can't let you die." He activated the device. A shimmering field of energy enveloped Zara, freezing her in time, preserving her life. But as the stasis field engaged, an unexpected surge of energy erupted from Zara, a blinding flash of light that knocked out the station's power grid in that section. Alarms blared, emergency lights flickered, and chaos erupted. In the sudden darkness, Douglas could only see the faint outline of Zara, suspended in the stasis field, her fate hanging precariously in the balance. The surge ripped through the station, a blue-white flash that bleached the observation room before plunging it into near darkness. Emergency lights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the sterile walls. A high-pitched whine filled the air, punctuated by the klaxon's insistent blare. Rostova's voice, amplified by the station's comms system, cut through the cacophony. "Sector Gamma lockdown! Seal all exits! Security teams, report to Gamma 7 immediately." Thorn, already moving, his face illuminated by the strobing red lights, tapped a sequence on his wrist-mounted datapad. "Cameras in this section are offline, for the moment. Let's move." He spared a glance at the observation window, now reflecting the chaotic scene. "I've rerouted power to life support in the stasis unit. It'll hold for a few hours, tops." Douglas didn't hesitate. He hefted the portable stasis unit, its weight suddenly amplified by the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Zara lay within, her small form still and unresponsive, a faint green glow emanating from the unit's internal systems. He could only pray Thorn's modifications held. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor. Rostova's team. Weapons fire echoed in the distance. "Go! I'll cover you!" Thorn yelled, already sprinting in the opposite direction. Douglas moved, the stasis unit a dead weight in his arms. He reached the security door at the end of the corridor, its access panel now stubbornly blank. "Damn it!" He pulled out his override key, his fingers fumbling with the small device. Precious seconds ticked by. A faint hum resonated from the stasis unit. Douglas glanced down. Zara's dark carapace, usually matte, pulsed with a faint internal light. Another, weaker energy pulse rippled outwards, subtly affecting the door's locking mechanism. The door chimed, the locking indicators flashing amber. "It's weakening the lock," Douglas realized, his mind racing. A nascent form of biokinesis. He shoved the override key into the slot, the door hissing open just as the security team rounded the corner. "There," Rostova's voice, cold and sharp. "Stop him!" Douglas burst through the door and sprinted towards the rarely used maintenance hangar bay, Thorn's diversion buying them precious time. He risked a glance back. Rostova and her team were gaining. The hangar bay loomed ahead, a cavernous space filled with deactivated repair drones and forgotten equipment. A single small transport sat in the center, its engines dark. Hope flickered. But even as he reached the hangar bay entrance, he saw more security teams converging from the other side. Rostova had anticipated their move. Then a ramp extended from the side of the transport, and a gruff voice echoed through the bay. "Took you long enough. Get aboard!" It was the smuggler from the cantina. Douglas didn't slow. He sprinted towards the ship, Thorn close behind. "Payment first!" the smuggler yelled, blocking their path. He was a hulking figure, his face scarred and his eyes hard. "Station's in lockdown. My risk just went up. I want it now. I have the data. Douglas said, his voice tight. "Classified Protectorate files. Enough to make you rich. Data's worthless if we're all vaporized," the smuggler sneered. "Hand it over, or I'm gone." "Deal!" Douglas yelled, tossing his datapad to the smuggler. Suddenly, the hangar doors buckled inward, and Rostova's forces stormed the bay, weapons blazing. Laser fire ripped through the air. "Launch sequence initiated," Thorne yelled, shoving Douglas towards the ramp. He turned to face the oncoming fire, drawing his sidearm. "Thorne, no!" Douglas shouted, but it was too late. A volley of laser fire struck Thorne, sending him crashing to the ground. "Get out of here, Douglas! Save her!" Thorne gasped, his voice fading. With a final surge of strength, he reached for the transport's launch controls, his fingers pressing the activation sequence. The transport's engines roared to life. Douglas, grief-stricken but resolute, stumbled up the ramp, clutching the stasis unit. Rostova stood at the edge of the hangar bay, her face a mask of fury. "Wilson, you won't get away with this. I will find you. I will retrieve that specimen." The ramp retracted and the transport lurched forward, accelerating towards the hangar bay doors. As they cleared the bay, Douglas risked a glance back. Rostova stood silhouetted against the flashing lights, her expression unreadable. The smuggler, already at the controls, grinned, a predatory glint in his eyes. "All right, let's get out of here. Oh, and Wilson, the Protectorate data was just a bonus. I was hired to retrieve the Eliani. Someone's very interested in her unique abilities." Douglas stared at the smuggler, his heart sinking. He had escaped the Protectorate, only to fall into the hands of someone far more dangerous. He looked down at Zara, her small form still encased in the stasis unit. He had to protect her, whatever it takes. The smuggler ship shuddered as it engaged its hyperdrive. Stars stretched and blurred, and then, with a lurch, they jumped to hyperspace, leaving Xylos Station behind and embarking on a perilous journey to the uncharted system. Wonder. The bunk was barely wider than his shoulders, the mattress thin and stained. Douglas pushed himself upright, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. Thorne, the image of his friend collapsing in the docking bay, seared itself anew into his memory. He scrubbed a hand across his face, forcing the grief down. Zara needed him. He found the portable stasis unit secured against a bulkhead. Zara's small form was visible through the shimmering field, but even to his untrained eye something was wrong. Her carapace, usually a deep, lustrous obsidian, was pale, almost gray. Her breathing, or whatever passed for it in stasis, was shallow and erratic. Stasis sickness, he'd read about it, but never seen it firsthand. It was far more dangerous for young, developing organisms. "Trouble sleeping, Doc?" Krell's voice rasped from the doorway. The smuggler leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his reptilian eyes unreadable. "Zara," Douglas said, his voice tight. "She's showing signs of stasis sickness. How much longer until we reach our destination?" Krell shrugged. Hyperspace jump was longer than anticipated. Had to reroute, bleed off some extra energy. Adds a few days. Nothing to worry about. "A few days could be fatal," Douglas countered, his voice rising. "Hey, I'm doing you a favor here," Krell snapped. "Don't push it. Besides, we need fuel and some repairs." Making an unscheduled stop, Douglas followed Krell out of the cramped cargo hold and into the even more cramped and grimy corridor. The ship was a rust bucket, barely holding together. Wires snaked across the walls, sparks occasionally flying. The crew, a motley assortment of aliens, eyed him with suspicion. This wasn't a transport. It was a coffin on thrusters. "Where are we stopping?" Douglas asked, trying to keep his voice level. The scrapyard, Krell replied, a glint in his eye. The scrapyard? Douglas repeated, a knot forming in his stomach. He'd heard stories. That's a lawless station. Relax, Doc, Krell said, clapping him on the shoulder a little too hard. It's just a quick stop. In and out. Besides, he lowered his voice, my employer is paying a premium for discretion. Can't exactly refuel at a protectorate depot, can we? He paused. Speaking of which, I haven't asked you about your benefactor, Douglas. Who has that kind of money? Douglas met his gaze, refusing to flinch. Someone who values Zara's safety. Right, Krell said, unconvinced. Well, I need a new phase regulator for the hyperdrive. It's a rare part. Only place to find it is the scrapyard. I'll be back before you know it. Douglas spent the next few hours near Zara's stasis unit, running his hand over the cold metal, speaking softly to her, telling her stories of Earth, of his childhood, of the stars he hoped they would see together. He noticed a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of bioluminescence on her carapace, a tiny spark of blue in the gray. She could hear him. She knew he was there. Then the ship lurched violently. Alarms blared, red lights flashing. Emergency landing, Krell's voice boomed over the intercom. Brace for impact. The scrapyard was everything Douglas had feared, and more. A chaotic jumble of interconnected modules and derelict ships orbiting a gas giant. The airlock hissed open, revealing a scene of utter pandemonium. Aliens of every conceivable species jostled through the crowded streets, hawking wares, gambling, fighting. The stench of unwashed bodies, cheap synth alcohol, and decaying metal hung heavy in the air. Stay close, Krell grunted, adjusting his blaster. This place isn't exactly known for its hospitality. I need that part, Krell said, and I need it fast. I can help, Douglas offered. I might be able to find it faster if we split up. Krell eyed him suspiciously. Why would you do that? I want to see this place, Douglas said, shrugging. Gather some information. Besides, you need that part, and I want to help Zara. Krell hesitated, then nodded. All right, but you're not going alone. Gronk, a hulking beetle-like alien with thick chitinous armor, lumbered forward. Gronk will make sure you don't get lost or cause any trouble. Douglas and Gronk stepped out into the throng, the noise and chaos washing over them. The district was a maze of narrow streets and shadowed lanes, a focus of worry and concern. I need information, Douglas said to Mark, raising his voice to be heard over the clamor, about Bell's associate. Anyone who might be interested in unique biological assets. He pressed a few credits into Gronk's massive hand. Discretion is paramount, Gronk grunted, his mandibles clicking. Information costs more than that, human. Douglas spent the next few hours subtly questioning various contacts, offering credits for information. Most clammed up at the mention of Krell's employer, their eyes darting nervously. Finally, a Rhodian fence, his face scarred and his voice raspy, leaned in close, heard whispers. The Rhodian hissed. Shadowy organization, interested in biological anomalies. Very dangerous, wouldn't say more for all the credits in the galaxy. The Rhodians scurried away, leaving Douglas with a chilling sense of unease. Shadowy organization, biological anomalies. It all pointed to something far more sinister than simple smuggling. He returned to the ship, his mind racing. He had to get Zara out of here. He found her even paler than before, the faint blue glow of her carapace almost extinguished. Her breathing was ragged, her tiny body trembling. He had to find medical supplies, and fast. Gronk, he said, I need to find a med station. Gronk grunted. Med station is other side of the scrapyard. Caution, area ahead. Rounding the bend, a group faces hidden attacked them there. Gronk shouted and charged, but they were fast. Too many foes. One of them slammed a stun baton into Gronk's back, sending the alien crashing to the ground. One of the thugs snarled, pointing a blaster at Douglas. "Give us the phase regulator, human." Douglas knew he couldn't reason with them. He had to protect himself and get those medical supplies. He feigned compliance, reaching for his pocket, then suddenly lashed out, his fingers finding the pressure point on the thug's wrist. The blaster clattered to the ground. He followed up with a swift kick to the thug's knee, sending him sprawling. The other thugs surged forward, but Douglas was ready. He used his knowledge of anatomy, his years of studying martial arts, to disable them quickly and efficiently, avoiding lethal force. A pressure point here, a joint lock there. He was no soldier, but he knew how to defend himself. He retrieved the phase regulator and Gronk's discarded blaster, then dragged the unconscious alien into a nearby alley. He had no time to help him. Zara was his priority. The med station was a squalid, dimly lit room, filled with the moans of the wounded and the stench of antiseptic. The medical supplies were expensive and of questionable quality, but he managed to purchase a few basic stimulants and a portable oxygenator. It was the best he could do. Back on the ship, he hooked up the oxygenator to Zara's stasis unit, praying it would be enough. He looked at her pale face, her fragile form, and made a decision. He couldn't trust Krell. He couldn't stay on the scrapyard. It was too dangerous. He scribbled a message on a piece of flimsiplast, leaving it on Krell's bunk. "Krell, I'm leaving with Zara. I'll contact you later regarding payment for the hyperspace jump. I know more about your employer than you think. Douglas." He took one last look at the cramped, dirty ship, then carefully lifted Zara's stasis unit and stepped back out into the chaos of the scrapyard. He had no plan, no destination, but he had Zara. And that was all that mattered. Douglas scanned the chaotic marketplace, 1,000 alien scents assaulting his senses, the cacophony of bartering voices grating on his nerves. He needed respite, a moment to think. He carefully maneuvered the stasis unit, its hum a fragile counterpoint to the scrapyard's din, until he found a less crowded corner, tucked between a towering stack of deactivated mechs and a flickering holographic advertisement for Xylan pleasure bots. The dim light offered a semblance of privacy. Zara's bioluminescence, usually a soft, reassuring pulse, flickered weakly beneath the stasis unit's transparent shell. Each faltering glow was a hammer blow to Douglas's dedication. He had to get her help, and fast. "Looking a little lost, friend?" A small, reedy voice cut through his thoughts. Douglas turned to see a diminutive alien, no taller than Zara would be in a few years, its skin a patchwork of iridescent scale. The alien, who introduced herself as Fenna, an information broker, tilted its head, its multifaceted eyes glinting in the dim light. "Heard you talking earlier about needing transport and urgent medical assistance." Douglas narrowed his eyes. "Information comes at a price, I presume." Fenna's scaled lips stretched into what might have been a smile. "Indeed. I know of several ships leaving the scrapyard soon. Freighters, transports, even a luxury liner heading Corward. But that kind of knowledge, it isn't free." Douglas hesitated. He didn't trust Fenna, not one bit. But Zara's flickering light was a stark reminder of his dwindling options. "What's the price?" "Depends on the destination. The discretion required." Fenna paused, its gaze flickering to the stasis unit. "Let's say 500 credits. Up front. 500? For information? Douglas scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm offering you a chance to save a life. Fenner shrugged, its iridescent scales shimmering. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills. Tell you what, I'll lower it to 300, in exchange for a small favor. A message delivered to a contact on another station, coded, of course. Douglas considered the offer. It was still a risk, but a manageable one. What kind of message? Doesn't matter to you. Just a few lines of text. My contact will know what to do with it. Fenner leaned closer, its voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and a word of advice. Krell's been asking around for you, offering a reward for your capture. Douglas's hand instinctively went to the worn blaster hidden beneath his jacket. Krell? How did he find me? He's persistent and well-connected. But that's not all. Fenner paused, its multifaceted eyes gleaming with what might have been genuine concern. Krell's employer, they're also looking for you, or rather, Subject 734, as they call her. They don't seem to know you're involved. A chill ran down Douglas's spine. Krell was bad enough, but a shadowy organization involved in illegal biological research. That was a whole different level of danger. What do you know about them? Fenner shook its head. Rumors, whispers. They're powerful, ruthless, involved in things best left undisturbed. It paused, but enough gloom. I have information you need. There's a freighter called the Wanderer, leaving Docking Bay Gamma 7 in 3 hours, known for its lax security. Docking schedule and security codes will cost you extra, of course, but I can include them in our deal. And the increased security I've noticed around the scrapyard? Douglas asked. Likely related to the search for Subject 734, Fenner said. They're tightening the net. You need to move fast. Douglas sighed, his gaze returning to Zara's flickering light. All right, Fenner. You have a deal. He transferred the credits to Fenner's account, accepting the data chip with the coded message. He carefully adjusted Zara's stasis unit, ensuring the life support systems were functioning optimally. 3 hours. Docking Bay Gamma 7. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He was walking into a potential trap, but he had no other choice. As Douglas made his way through the crowded marketplace, a pair of hulking figures detached themselves from the throng. Their reptilian eyes narrowed, focusing on Douglas with predatory intensity. One of them hissed, "That's him, Wilson and the package." The thugs surged forward, their massive hands reaching for Douglas and the stasis unit. The marketplace erupted in chaos. As vendors screamed and scattered, Douglas reacted instantly. He shoved the stasis unit behind a stack of crates, creating a temporary barrier. "Stay back," he yelled, his hand tightening on his blaster. The thugs ignored his warning, their faces contorted with greed and malice. Douglas knew he couldn't afford a prolonged firefight. He needed to disable them quickly. He moved left, then struck a quick blow to the front man's leg, making him stumble. The second man rushed, but Douglas avoided him and hit his neck. The thug gasped for air, clutching his throat. Douglas grabbed a nearby metal pipe and swung it with brutal efficiency, connecting with the thug's temple. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. But the first thug was back on his feet, his eyes burning with rage. He charged, roaring like a wounded beast. Douglas knew he couldn't win this fight. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and he had to protect Zara. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine filled the air. The two thugs convulsed, their bodies spasming uncontrollably. They collapsed to the ground, twitching and groaning. Fenner emerged from the crowd, a small device in its scaled hand. "Go, now!" "I disabled them temporarily, but they'll be back on their feet soon enough." Douglas stared at Fenner, his mind racing. Why had she helped him? Why? "No time for questions," Fenner snapped. "Trust me, or don't, but if you want to get out of here alive, you'll follow me. I know a safer route to the docking bay. A less conspicuous one." Douglas hesitated. Trusting Fenner was a gamble, a potentially fatal one. But Zara's life was on the line. He had no other choice. "All right," he said, his voice tight with suspicion. "Lead the way." Fenner nodded, its multifaceted eyes glinting in the dim light. "This way, and stay close." Fenner led Douglas through a narrow opening behind a stack of discarded engine parts. The opening led to a dark, twisting passage beneath the scrapyard, the air thick with the stench of decay and forgotten technology. Douglas followed Fenner, his blaster raised, his senses on high alert. The passage was claustrophobic, the walls closing in around him, but it was also deserted, free from the prying eyes of Krell's thugs and the Protectorate security patrols. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Fenner stopped before a rusted metal door. "Docking Bay Gamma 7 is just beyond this door," Fenner said. "The Wanderer is preparing for departure. Good luck, friend." Douglas nodded, his gaze fixed on the door. "Thank you, Fenner, for everything." Fenner shrugged, its iridescent scales shimmering in the dim light. "Just doing my job. Now, go. Before it's too late." Douglas pushed open the door and stepped out into the bustling docking bay, Zara's stasis unit floating silently beside him. The Wanderer loomed before him, its engines rumbling, ready to depart. He was close, so close, but he knew, deep down, that the real danger was just beginning. The freighter loomed, a patchwork of welded metal and mismatched plating that seemed to absorb the dim light of the spaceport. Fenner led Douglas to a section of the hull away from the main gangway, where a series of precarious-looking scaffolding clung to the ship like rust. "Less official entrance," she said, her voice barely audible above the hum of the station, "but less likely to attract attention." Douglas eyed the climb. It was a good 20 meters to the nearest access hatch, a dizzying ascent made even more treacherous by the narrow platforms and the bulky stasis unit weighing heavily on his arms. He adjusted his grip, the cold metal biting into his gloved hands. Zara's fragile form felt even more vulnerable with every step. Fenner, surprisingly agile, scrambled up the scaffolding ahead of him. "Almost there," she called down, then paused, tapping a small device against a junction box. "Security camera. Give me a moment." A flicker, then darkness. "Disable temporarily. Move quickly." He began the ascent, each step a calculated risk. The stasis unit was awkward, throwing his balance off, and the wind buffeted him mercilessly. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, a cold sheen under the helmet. He risked a glance down, a mistake that sent a jolt of vertigo through him. He focused on the next rung, then the next, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally he reached the access hatch, a crude, circular opening sealed with a manual locking wheel. Fenner wrestled it open, the mechanism groaning in protest. "In you go," she said, gesturing into the darkness beyond. He squeezed through the opening, his boots clanging on the metal deck. They were in a dimly lit cargo bay, vast and cavernous, filled with stacks of crates and containers of all shapes and sizes. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, stale fuel, and something vaguely organic. "Welcome to the Wanderer," Fenna said, her voice echoing in the space. Reputation for flexibility means we're less likely to be asked too many questions. Also means it's a bit rough around the edges. Douglas scanned the bay, his hand instinctively moving towards the energy pistol at his hip. He needed to get Zara out of the stasis unit, and soon. The longer she remained, the greater the risk. Somewhere we can rest. Check on her? Fenna hesitated, then pointed towards a particularly large shipping container, its side emblazoned with faded corporate logos. There's a hidden compartment in that one, used for discreet cargo. Should be quiet. Douglas frowned. He didn't like it. He didn't like any of this. Fenna's eagerness was unsettling, her knowledge of the ship's layout too precise. Was she leading him into a trap? But he had no other options, no other place to go. He was running out of time. Lead the way. They approached the container, Fenna tapping a sequence on a concealed keypad. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a cramped space filled with tightly packed crates. But it wasn't the crates that caught Douglas's attention. It was their contents, rows of energy weapons, still in their packaging, vials of shimmering, iridescent liquid, and stacks of data chips, their labels scratched off. Smuggled goods, illegal contraband. He was on a ship full of criminals. He pushed the thought aside. He had more pressing concerns. He carefully placed the stasis unit on the floor of the compartment and knelt beside it, his fingers fumbling with the release latches. He popped the top and peered inside. Zara's face was pale, her breathing shallow and erratic. The monitors on the unit flickered erratically, displaying a cascade of error messages. The stasis field was weakening. It was failing. Damn it, he muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. She needs help. Now. Fenna hovered behind him, her expression unreadable. There's someone on board. Calls himself a doctor. Bit of a back-alley medic, but he knows his stuff. Won't be cheap and definitely won't ask any questions. Douglas hesitated. A back-alley medic on a ship full of smugglers? It was a gamble, a desperate one. But he had no choice. Take me to him. Fenna nodded, her eyes glinting in the dim light. This way. But be warned, it's not the nicest part of the ship. She led him out of the cargo bay and into a labyrinthine network of corridors, the metal walls scarred and dented, the air thick with the smell of sweat, cheap liquor, and desperation. The further they went, the seedier it became. Gambling dens spilled out into the passageways, their patrons a motley collection of spacers, mercenaries, and lowlifes. Illicit shops lined the walls, their wares displayed openly, weapons, drugs, and stolen goods. They rounded a corner and found their path blocked by a group of rough-looking crew members, their faces etched with tattoos and hard living. Toll, one of them growled, stepping forward. Passage through our territory ain't free. Fenna stepped in front of Douglas, her hand reaching into her pocket. We're just passing through, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. Got something you might want. She produced one of the vials from the hidden compartment, its iridescent liquid shimmering in the light. The crew members' eyes widened. That'll do, the leader said, snatching the vial. Move along. As they squeezed past the group, Douglas's gaze swept the crowd, and then he saw him. A face he recognized, a face he'd hoped never to see again. One of Krell's thugs, disguised in a faded crew uniform, his eyes scanning the crowd with predatory intensity. Fenna? Douglas hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her into a narrow alleyway between two shops. We've been made. Fenna stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. What? Who? Krell's people. He's here. Or at least one of them is. He glanced back at the passageway. The thug was still there, his gaze sweeping back and forth. We need to move, now. The doctor, Fenner stammered. He's in the restricted section, past security checkpoints. Douglas cursed under his breath. Restricted section, security checkpoints. It was getting worse and worse. We don't have a choice. We need to get to him. Can you bypass the security? Fenner nodded, her face pale but determined. I know the systems. It'll be risky, but I can do it. They huddled in the alleyway, quickly devising a plan, their voices barely above a whisper. But as they were about to move, a high-pitched whine filled the air, followed by a series of rapid beeps. Douglas looked down at the stasis unit, its monitors now completely dark. No, he whispered, his voice filled with dread. No, no, no. He ripped open the top of the unit and stared down at Zara. Her skin was ashen, her breathing almost non-existent. The stasis field had collapsed completely. She was dying. He had a choice to make, a desperate choice. Risk everything to get her to the doctor, or watch her die here, in this filthy alleyway, on a ship full of criminals. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. Now, he said, his voice hard with tenacity, we go now. Douglas pressed his fingers against Zara's carapace, searching for a pulse he couldn't find. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. He blew a shaky breath into her face, feeling only the faintest whisper of air in return. We don't have time for this, Fenner hissed, grabbing his arm. She needs Doc Rook now. Douglas pulled away, his eyes narrowed. I don't trust you. Trust me or watch her die. Fenner snapped, her voice tight with urgency. That's your choice. He looked down at Zara's still form, then back at Fenner, his teeth clenched. He gave a short, jerky nod. Lead the way. Fenner didn't waste a second. She pulled him through the crowded marketplace, weaving through stalls, overflowing with strange fruits and scavenged tech. The air thrummed with the chaotic energy of 1,000 alien voices. They reached a dingy gambling den, the air thick with smoke and the clatter of dice. Fenner didn't hesitate. She pushed past a hulking bouncer and headed straight for a curtained alcove in the back. Wait here, she said, then disappeared behind the curtain. A moment later she reappeared, pulling back the heavy fabric to reveal a hidden door. He's expecting us, but be warned, Rook isn't exactly conventional. The door opened into a small, sterile medical bay. Gleaming chrome instruments lay neatly arranged on a steel table. The air smelled of antiseptic and something vaguely metallic. In the center of the room, a tall, gaunt alien with a cybernetic eye and numerous metallic implants stood examining a row of vials. This was Doc Rook. He didn't look up. Took you long enough. Lay her on the table. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. Douglas gently placed Zara on the cold metal surface. Rook finally turned, his cybernetic eye gleaming with an unsettling intensity. He ran a scanner over Zara's body, his expression detached and professional. Stasis sickness, he said, his voice flat. Nasty. Needs a serum, rare and expensive. Also, he paused, his cybernetic eye focusing on Zara's genetic code. She's got a unique marker. Never seen anything quite like it. Douglas's heart sank. How much for the serum? Rook chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Enough. More than you can afford, I'd wager. He named an exorbitant price, a sum that made Douglas's stomach clench. I don't have that kind of money, Douglas said, his voice tight, but I can give you everything I have. All the credits, plus the smuggled goods we found in the compartment. Rook considered this for a moment, then shook his head. The credits are acceptable, the goods less so. But that genetic marker, he trailed off, his cybernetic eye gleaming again. No, credits won't do. I'm more interested in studying her. Douglas stepped forward, his fists clenching. Studying her. What are you talking about? Rook shrugged. Her biology is fascinating. I could learn a great deal, perhaps even improve upon it. You're not touching her, Douglas growled, his voice low and dangerous. Douglas, no, Fenna warned. Don't antagonize him. She turned to Rook, her expression pleading. Please, Doctor. She's just a child. Can't you see that? Surely there's some decency left in you. Rook merely stared at her, his cybernetic eye cold and unblinking. Control is lost. I can't hold on now. The door opened to the med bay and a figure with a weapon entered. Krell's associate. There you are, he roared, leveling his weapon at Douglas. Krell wants his goods back. Chaos erupted. Blaster fire tore through the room, sending instruments flying. Fenna screamed and ducked behind a table. Rook cursed and stumbled backward, clutching his side. A stray shot had grazed his cybernetic implants. Douglas reacted instantly. He grabbed a scalpel from the table and lunged at the thug, slashing at his arm. The thug roared in pain and stumbled back, dropping his blaster. Douglas kicked the weapon away and tackled the thug to the ground, pinning him beneath his weight. But the sound of the firefight had attracted attention. More shouts echoed from the gambling den, and the sounds of approaching footsteps grew louder. Rook, clutching his wounded side, saw an opportunity. "All right, human," he rasped. "I'll give you the serum, but you have to get me out of here, and you're taking the girl with you." "What?" Douglas said. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I'm not stupid," Rook said, his voice strained. "Krell will be back with more men, and the Protectorate will be here soon too. I need to disappear, and that specimen is my ticket out. Her genetics are worth a fortune on the black market." Fenna emerged from behind the table, her face pale with fear. "Douglas, don't. He's using you." "He'll sell her to the highest bidder." Douglas looked from Fenna to Rook, his mind racing. He didn't trust Rook, not one bit, but Zara was fading fast. Zara began to convulse on the table, her small body racked with tremors. Her carapace pulsed with a faint, erratic light. Douglas's breath hitched. He had no choice. "All right," he said, his voice tight with desperation. "I'll help you escape, but you give me the serum first, and you lay one finger on her. One, and I'll kill you myself." "But you understand," Douglas said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands, "that before we move another step, you provide Zara with what aid you can." Now, his gaze didn't waver from Rook's multifaceted eyes. "I won't risk her life a moment longer than necessary on your promises." Rook hissed, a sound like escaping steam, but the urgency in Douglas's tone, the unwavering dedication in his eyes, seemed to sway him. He gestured impatiently. "Fine, but understand, this is a temporary measure. It will alleviate the symptoms, buy us some time, but the serum is paramount." He pulled a small device from his belt, a complex injector filled with a luminescent fluid. He approached Zara cautiously, muttering what sounded like apologies in his guttural tongue. The injection was quick, and Zara, though still weak, seemed to relax slightly. Her breathing, ragged moments before, evened out. "It's something Douglas admitted, relief flooding him. Fenner, ever practical, stepped forward. I know this, freighter. The main corridors will be heavily guarded, but the cargo holds and the maintenance tunnels. There's a route, risky, but it avoids most of the crew. She unrolled a holographic schematic of the ship on a nearby crate, tracing a path with her finger. We move quickly, quietly. No unnecessary risks. Douglas met Fenner's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He's playing us, he murmured, barely audible. Fenner nodded, her expression grim. He needs us, for now, but the moment he doesn't, we watch him closely. Vrook, overhearing, bristled. Are you questioning my commitment? My knowledge of this vessel is paramount. I will lead the way. I know the security systems, the blind spots. He paused, a glint in his eye. Trust me, human. I am your only hope. The trio moved into the dimly lit cargo hold, a labyrinth of stacked containers and humming machinery. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and alien spices. For a while, they encountered minimal crew activity, the silence amplifying the tension. Vrook, true to his word, seemed to know the layout intimately. He led them through a narrow passage, then stopped abruptly. Security camera, he hissed, pointing to a small, almost invisible lens mounted on the ceiling. I can disable it. He produced a small device, fiddled with its settings, and pointed it at the camera. A brief surge of energy, a flicker, and the camera went dark. Done. But it may have triggered a silent alarm. We must hurry. What Vrook didn't say, what Douglas and Fenner didn't immediately realize, was that the surge had indeed triggered an alarm, a subtle signal that flashed on a console deep within the ship's security center. Rounding a corner, they stumbled upon a two-member Krell patrol, their weapons drawn. Hold, one of them barked, their reptilian eyes narrowing. Panic flared. There was no time to react, only to hide. Douglas shoved Zara and Fenner behind a stack of containers, squeezing himself in beside them. Vrook, however, seemed to hesitate for a split second. Then, with a callous disregard, pushed Zara further behind the containers, ensuring his concealment was optimal, regardless of her safety. Douglas's blood ran cold. He'd seen enough. He couldn't risk Zara being exposed. Distraction, he muttered to Fenner. I'll draw them away. Before Fenner could protest, Douglas stepped out from behind the containers, raising his hands. Looking for someone? He asked, his voice deceptively calm. The Krell patrol turned their attention to him, their weapons trained on his chest. You are in a restricted area. Identify yourself. Douglas grinned, a flash of teeth in the dim light. Let's just say, I'm here to redistribute some cargo. He lunged forward, catching the first Krell off guard, disarming him with a swift, practiced move. The second Krell fired, but Douglas dodged, using the first Krell as a shield. A brief, brutal fight ensued, a flurry of punches and kicks. Douglas, despite being outnumbered, fought with a ferocity born of desperation, his movements precise and efficient. He managed to subdue both Krell, leaving them unconscious on the floor. But the commotion had attracted attention. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the cargo hold. Vrook, seeing an opportunity, darted out from behind the containers. Fools, he hissed. You're all going to get caught. He grabbed a small medical kit lying near Zara, the one containing the temporary aid he'd administered, and turned to flee. Fenner, her eyes narrowed with fury, intercepted him. You're not going anywhere, she snarled, grabbing his arm. Rook struggled, hissing and spitting. Get out of my way, female, I have to save myself. A brief but intense struggle ensued. Rook, despite his smaller stature, was surprisingly strong. He lashed out with a sharp claw, catching Fenna across the arm. She cried out in pain but held on, managing to wrench the medical kit from his grasp. The action diverted him onto a wrong path. Suddenly, a booming voice echoed through the cargo hold. "So, this is where you've been hiding, traitor." Krell himself stepped into view, his massive frame filling the passage, his eyes burning with rage. He blocked their only escape route. Douglas, his breath ragged, turned to face Krell, placing himself between the hulking alien and Zara. Fenna, clutching her injured arm, knelt beside Zara, trying to shield her. Zara whimpered, her breathing becoming shallow again. The temporary aid was wearing off. As Douglas and Krell locked eyes, a new figure emerged from the shadows, a cloaked figure, their face obscured, observing the scene with detached interest. Their presence hinted at a larger game, a deeper conspiracy. Fenna, her face pale with pain and desperation, looked at Douglas, then at Zara, then back at Krell. I can help you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Spare me, and I'll tell you everything you want to know about them. Help but wonder if I was making the right choice." "We have to reroute the life support," Fenna said, her voice strained but firm. She leaned heavily against the corridor wall, one hand pressed against her bleeding side. "Create a temporary imbalance. It'll buy us time to reach an escape pod." Douglas held Zara tighter, her small body trembling against him. "What are the risks?" Fenna winced. "Significant. We could jeopardize the entire freighter's system, and Krell will know exactly where the disruption originates. He'll be on us in minutes." He looked at Zara, her face pale and drawn, her breathing shallow. He looked at Fenna, injured but resolute, her eyes filled with a desperate hope. He trusted her. He had to. "Do it," he said, his voice low. Rook, who had been huddled in the corner, whimpered. "Are you insane?" "That's insane. He'll doom us all. We should just give in." Douglas ignored him. "Fenna, guide me. What do I need to do?" Fenna pushed herself upright, wincing. "The main junction is through the service tunnels. I know the schematics. It's tight, and probably not pressurized." Zara coughed, a rattling sound that sent a jolt of fear through Douglas. Her carapace, usually a vibrant blue-green, was losing its color, fading to a sickly gray. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight with urgency. He adjusted Zara in his arms and followed Fenna into the narrow, dimly lit maintenance tunnel. Rook trailed behind, muttering curses under his breath. The tunnels were a claustrophobic maze of pipes, wires, and exposed conduits. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the air hung thick with the smell of stale coolant and ozone. Fenna, despite her injury, moved with surprising speed, her hand scanner illuminating the way. Zara's breathing grew more labored with each step. Douglas could feel her small body growing weaker in his arm. He had to hurry. "The junction is just ahead," Fenna said, pointing to a panel recessed in the wall. "You'll need to reroute the primary coolant feed to auxiliary life support. It'll overload the system temporarily, causing the imbalance." Douglas worked quickly, his fingers flying over the controls. Sparks flew as he bypassed safety protocols, the air crackling with energy. Finally, with a surge of power, the system rerouted. Alarms blared throughout the freighter. "That'll do it," Fenna said, her voice breathless. Almost immediately, the temperature in the tunnel plummeted. A blast of frigid air rushed through the passage, making them gasp. "He knows," Fenna said, her eyes wide with fear. "He's coming." As if on cue, the tunnel shuddered. A section of the ceiling collapsed, showering them with dust and debris. A hiss of escaping gas filled the air, acrid and burning. "Toxic leak!" Fenner shouted. "We need to move." Douglas coughed, his eyes watering. He wrapped his arms tighter around Zara, trying to shield her from the fumes. He remembered his training, a lifetime ago, and quickly fashioned a makeshift filter from his tunic, pressing it over Zara's face. "This way!" Fenner yelled, leading them through a maze of twisted metal and sparking wires. Rook stumbled, his foot catching on a loose cable. He cried out, his voice echoing through the tunnel. Fenner whirled around, her face contorted with anger. "Shut up, you idiot!" she hissed. She grabbed him by the arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and shoved him forward. "One more sound, and I'll leave you for Krell." They pressed on, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Finally, they reached the escape pod bay. The sight that greeted them was disheartening. Most of the pods were charred and twisted, victims of a recent battle or simply years of neglect. Emergency lights flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows across the cavernous space. The air hung thick with the smell of burnt metal and despair. Douglas scanned the bay frantically, his heart sinking with each passing moment. "There," Fenner said, pointing to a pod tucked away in a corner. "That's the only one that looks operational." But as they approached, Douglas saw the problem. The pod was small, designed for a single occupant. The sound of Krell's footsteps echoed through the corridor, growing closer, louder. One pod, 3 lives. An impossible choice. Douglas looked at Zara, her face pale and fragile, her eyes wide with fear. He looked at Fenner, injured but resolute, her gaze filled with a silent understanding. He looked at Vrook, cowering in the corner, his face a mask of terror. He began preparing the pod, his movements mechanical, his face a mask of commitment and sorrow. He uploaded the launch sequence, his fingers trembling as he entered the coordinates. Then, a piercing alarm blared through the bay. A message flashed on the pod's control panel. "Distress signal detected. Sector Gamma 7. The escape pod, a guaranteed path, however narrow, to something," or the static-laced plea crackling through the freighter's comm system, a siren song of the unknown. Douglas hesitated, the flashing green light of the escape pod indicator, a monotonous hum in his mind, a promise of cold, sterile safety. "Douglas," Fenner's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and pragmatic. "The escape pod is viable, yes, but limited. The distress signal. It could be a trap, undoubtedly, but it also suggests a potential escape route Krell doesn't know about, or at least hasn't secured. And perhaps resources." Vrook predictably whined. "Resources? We have an escape pod. Why risk our lives for some ghost signal? Let's go now." But then Zara coughed, a wet, rattling sound that echoed in the narrow corridor. Her small frame shook violently, and her breathing came in ragged, shallow gasps. The green tinge to her carapace was fading, replaced by a worrying pallor. Douglas didn't need any more convincing. Escape pod or no, resources or trap, Zara was running out of time. He made a split-second decision. "We're going to check the signal." Rook sputtered. "Are you insane? Krell will find us either way." Douglas interrupted, his voice steel-edged. "But if that signal leads to a medical bay, or even just a functioning oxygen filter, it's Zara's only chance." He turned to Fenner. "Can you reroute us?" Fenner nodded, her expression grim but determined. "I can try." The system's corrupted, but I can bypass the primary navigation and use the maintenance tunnels. They found a damaged maintenance bot, a squat, multi-legged machine missing several limbs and sparking erratically. With Fenner's diagnostic skills and Douglas's practical ingenuity, they managed to coax it back to a semblance of functionality, jury-rigging a harness to secure Zara to its back. It wasn't pretty, but it was mobile. The abandoned section of the freighter was even more dilapidated and dangerous than the maintenance tunnels. Structural supports had buckled, leaving gaping holes in the floor. Flickering emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows that danced with the dust motes in the stale air. Scorch marks scarred the walls, and twisted metal lay scattered across the floor, silent testament to some long-forgotten conflict. The environmental hazards intensified with every meter they traveled. Radiation leak warnings blared intermittently from damaged control panels. They passed through pockets of near vacuum where the air thinned, and Zara coughed, clutching at Douglas. Mutated flora, glowing with an unnatural luminescence, sprouted from cracks in the walls, their thorny vines twitching ominously. A burst of radiation washed over them from a ruptured coolant pipe. Douglas, without hesitation, threw himself in front of Zara, shielding her small body with his own. He felt the burning tingle on his skin, the metallic taste in his mouth, but he held firm, his focus solely on protecting her. Fenner, witnessing his selflessness, her brow furrowed with concern. "Douglas, please stop doing that. You'll hurt yourself." There was warmth in her voice, a hint of deeper, caring concern. Then Krell's voice boomed over the freighter's comm system, crackling with malicious glee. "Running, little rats, hiding in the shadows? I know where you're going. That old escape pod signal? Sent it myself. Just wanted to see how desperate you were." His laughter echoed through the corridors, a chilling promise of their impending doom. Rook, his face pale with terror, grabbed at Fenner's arm. "He's right. It's a trap. We have to go back. We have to surrender." Fenner, her eyes blazing with anger, wrenched her arm free and shoved Rook against the wall. "Shut up, you spineless coward! We're not giving up. Not now." She physically restrained him, pinning him against the cold metal. They reached the location of the distress signal, a crashed escape pod, half buried in debris, its hull breached and scorched. The air around it reeked of ozone and burnt metal. Inside, slumped against the mangled controls, was its occupant. It was another young alien girl, no older than Zara, her skin a pale lavender, her large black eyes wide with shock and pain. She was clutching a tattered doll to her chest, her small body trembling. The alien girl looked up at them, her eyes filled with terror and desperation. In broken galactic standard, she whispered, "Sanctuary, hidden, safe." Krell's heavy footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. He appeared at the end of the corridor, his hulking figure silhouetted against the flickering emergency lights, blocking their path to the sanctuary. The corridor behind them erupted in a concussive blast, the salvaged power cells detonating with a satisfying, if crude, thoom. Dust and debris billowed, momentarily obscuring their pursuers. "This way," Fenner barked, already sprinting towards a junction Douglas hadn't even registered. "Maintenance shafts. Krell will expect us to keep running down the main corridors." The shafts were cramped, barely wide enough for Douglas to squeeze through. The metal grated against his armor, and the air hung thick with the smell of ozone and stale lubricant. "Are you sure about this, Fenner?" he grunted, pushing forward. "Trust me," she replied, her voice tight with urgency. "Krell thinks like a soldier. He'll take the obvious route. These shafts, they're not on the ship's schematics he'll have access to. A pained yelp echoed from behind. Blast it all, Rook cursed. My leg, I think I twisted it. Douglas swore under his breath. He could feel his patience fraying. Rook's panic was a liability. He glanced back. The Grath was hobbling, his face contorted in pain. "Can you walk?" Douglas asked, though he already knew the answer. Rook shook his head, his large eyes wide with fear. I don't think so." Douglas sighed. He didn't have time for this, but he couldn't leave him behind. "All right, hold on." He adjusted his grip on his weapon, then awkwardly scooped Rook up, supporting the Grath's weight against his side. The added burden was significant, and the narrow shaft made movement even more difficult. They pressed on, Fenna leading the way, her lithe form moving with surprising agility through the confined space. Lyra, pale and clutching her arm, followed close behind. Finally, they reached a wider section of the shaft, opening into a small circular chamber. A reinforced blast door dominated one wall, a coded keypad beside it. "What is this place?" Douglas asked, gently lowering Rook to the floor. Lyra stared at the door, her eyes wide. She swayed slightly, her breathing shallow. I think I know this place," she whispered, her voice trembling. It's the sanctuary." "Sanctuary?" Fenna questioned, her brow furrowed. Lyra nodded, her gaze fixed on the keypad. I used to live here. Before everything." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the numbers. I remember the code." Her voice was barely audible. She punched in the sequence, her movements jerky and uncertain. The blast door hissed open, revealing a starkly contrasting scene. The grimy, decaying corridors of the freighter gave way to a pristine, sterile environment. Polished plasteel walls gleamed under soft, diffused lighting. The air was clean and filtered, devoid of the metallic tang that permeated the rest of the ship. A group of alien children stood in the center of the room, their faces blank and expressionless. They were a motley collection of species, their ages ranging from what Douglas guessed to be early childhood to adolescence. But their eyes lacked spark, their movements were listless, their posture defeated. A tall, slender alien with smooth gray skin and large, placid eyes approached them, a gentle smile gracing his lips. He wore a simple white robe, and his demeanor exuded a calm benevolence. "Welcome," he said, his voice soft and soothing. "I am the caretaker. We have been expecting you." Douglas narrowed his eyes, his hand instinctively tightening on his weapon. "Expecting us?" The caretaker inclined his head. "We monitor all transmissions on this vessel. We know of your predicament. We offer you sanctuary, a place to rest and recover. And, of course," his gaze softened as he looked at Zara, "immediate medical attention for the little one." Relief washed over Douglas. Zara was still pale and weak from their ordeal. That would be greatly appreciated. Two attendants, their faces equally placid and unreadable, approached and gently took Zara from Douglas's arms. He hesitated for a moment, then released her, trusting that she would be safe. Lyra gasped softly as she spotted a familiar face among the group of children. "Ilara," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She rushed forward and embraced a young alien girl with iridescent scales and large watery eyes. But the girl's response was muted, her hug limp and unenthusiastic. Fenna, meanwhile, was scanning the room, her eyes sharp and observant. She subtly gestured towards a series of small, almost invisible lenses embedded in the walls and ceiling. Surveillance systems. Douglas turned back to the caretaker, forcing a polite smile. "This is a remarkable facility. What exactly is its purpose?" The caretaker's smile didn't waver, but his eyes seemed to flicker for a fraction of a second. "We provide a safe haven for orphaned and displaced children. We offer them shelter, education, and medical care. We prepare them for a brighter future." His answer felt rehearsed, hollow. "And how long have you been operating?" Douglas pressed, keeping his voice casual. "For many cycles," the caretaker replied vaguely. "Long enough to have helped countless children find new homes and new lives." Douglas frowned. Something about the caretaker's demeanor, the children's subdued behavior, the sterile environment, it all felt wrong. He glanced around, searching for Vrook. The Grath had been resting against the wall, but now he was gone. "Where's Vrook?" Douglas asked. His voice permeated with concern. "He mentioned he was feeling peckish," the caretaker said, his smile widening slightly. "I'm sure he's simply found his way to the mess hall. He will be well taken care of." Lyra tugged at Douglas's sleeve, her eyes wide with terror. She pulled him closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Douglas, you have to listen to me. This isn't what it seems. The caretaker, he's not helping us. He's experimenting on the children." Douglas stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What are you talking about?" I saw things," Lyra stammered, her voice trembling. "When I lived here, I saw things I shouldn't have. Experiments, procedures. They weren't helping us. They were changing us." His blood ran cold. He had to find Zara. He pushed past Lyra, his eyes scanning the room. He spotted a door at the far end of the chamber, marked with a medical symbol. He moved towards it, his pace quickening. He reached the door and peered inside. A sterile medical bay bathed in harsh white light. And there, on a surgical table, lay Zara, unconscious. Attendants were prepping her for a procedure, their movements precise and emotionless. Douglas felt a surge of rage, hot and primal. He was about to burst into the room when a voice echoed through the sanctuary's intercom system, smooth and chillingly familiar. "Welcome to my little paradise, Consultant Wilson." Krell's voice dripped with malice. "I knew you'd find your way here eventually. The caretaker and I have been expecting you, and your little specimen." Douglas slammed the caretaker against the sterile wall of the medical bay, the man's breath wheezing in his throat. "Where are the children? What have you done to them?" His voice, usually calm, was a low, guttural growl. The caretaker, eyes wide with fear, gasped, I was only trying to help them, to protect them." "Protect them? By experimenting on them? By turning them into weapons?" Douglas tightened his grip. "It was the only way." The caretaker's voice cracked. "The Protectorate, they only care about strength. If these children can't offer something, they'll be discarded. I was giving them a purpose, a chance to survive." He revealed, eyes glistening with desperate conviction, that he believed weaponizing the children's unique abilities was the only way to ensure their species' survival in a hostile galaxy. A cold voice cut through the sterile air. A noble sentiment, perhaps, but ultimately inefficient. Krell stepped from the shadows, a predatory smile twisting his lips. "I, on the other hand, have a far more profitable use for young Zara and her unique genetic makeup." His gaze lingered on Douglas, a glint of cruel amusement in his eyes. Personal gain, you see, is a far more reliable motivator than altruism. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a klaxon blared through the sanctuary. The doors to the medical bay slammed shut, sealing them inside. "What's happening?" Krell snarled, spinning around. A voice, tinny but clear, echoed through the comm system. "Sorry, gentlemen." Lyra's voice, tinged with newfound steel, announced, "But I can't let you leave. Not with the children." Using her intimate knowledge of the sanctuary's systems, she had initiated a lockdown, trapping Krell and the caretaker. From the corner of Rook, his face etched with shame, pushed himself to his feet. "Lyra is right," he said, his voice trembling but firm. This has to stop. I can't undo what I've done, but I can help them escape." He moved towards the control panel, intent on overriding the lockdown on the other children's cells, a desperate attempt to atone for his complicity. He knew Krell wouldn't let him live, and he accepted that fate. The commotion stirred Zara from her induced sleep. Disoriented but sensing Douglas's distress, she focused her mind. Krell lunged for Lyra's control panel, but before he could reach it, a wave of raw energy erupted from Zara. Her bioelectric pulse, amplified by her fear and protective instinct, slammed into Krell, sending him sprawling to the floor, unconscious. Douglas, seeing his opportunity, released the caretaker and moved with surprising speed. He disarmed the man, tossing the weapon aside. "It's over," he said, his voice firm. "You're hurting them, and I won't let you." He wrestled the caretaker to the ground, securing him with restraints. Just then the screech of approaching ships filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. A protectorate fleet had arrived, responding to Lyra's distress signal and the sanctuary's automated lockdown protocols. Hours later, Commander Rostova stood in the ruined medical bay, her face pale as she surveyed the scene. The evidence of the caretaker's experiments was undeniable. Rows of children in stasis pods, their bodies hooked up to strange machines. Krell lay unconscious, his face contorted in a sneer. The truth of the refuge's wrongs was revealed, forcing her to confront the authorities' involvement in the harm. Weeks later, Douglas stood before the Galactic Council, the holographic faces of its members arrayed before him. He spoke with passion and conviction, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "These children," he said, gesturing to a holographic image of Zara, Lyra, and the others, "are not weapons. They are not experiments. They are living beings, deserving of respect, compassion, and the right to a future." He exposed the sanctuary's atrocities, detailing the caretaker's experiments and Krell's depravity. The council listened in stunned silence, the evidence of the sanctuary's abuses undeniable. After days of deliberation, the Galactic Council issued its verdict. The experiments were condemned, the caretaker and Krell were imprisoned, and sweeping reforms were initiated to prevent similar abuses in the future. Months later, in a small private ceremony, Douglas Wilson formally adopted Zara. The legal process was long, but his effort and Zara's kindness had won. The ruling set a precedent, opening the door for interspecies adoption throughout the galaxy. Years later, Douglas and Zara stood together, looking out at the stars from the veranda of their new home. It was a sanctuary of their own creation, a haven for orphaned alien children from across the galaxy. The laughter of children, a symphony of different species and voices, filled the air. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found me?" Zara asked, her voice soft. Douglas placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with love. "I don't like to think about it," he said. "But I'm here now, and we're a family. The stars twinkled above them, a vast and endless expanse of possibility. Their sanctuary stood as a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of compassion and understanding to overcome fear and prejudice. The Galactic Council's reforms ended the old, harsh system for all children. Douglas and Zara had built a place where every child, regardless of their species or origin, could find safety, love, and a chance to shine. They were an unlikely family, forged in fear and loss, but bound together by an unbreakable love. As they looked out at the stars, they knew that their journey had just begun, and that together they could make a difference in the galaxy, one child at a time.